Welcome to the Low Carb USA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
So, hey, Casey Means, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Doug and Pam. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, so Casey has been very gracious in lending or giving us opportunity to test out this Levels app that they have developed in conjunction with utilizing a CGM from Libre, and so we did it. So the last 2 weeks we've both been wearing it, and we've had some fascinating insights. So yeah, first of all, thanks very much for that, Casey. And one of the things that we noticed was like, you put on the sensor to start with, and that's all Libre stuff. But then you link up with Levels, and that's like an app that sits on top of that brings a whole lot of added value to the picture. So I feel like maybe that's a good place to start, is saying, okay, this is what Levels is. This is what we do. This is what we bring to the table, and this is what we add on top of the basic sensor data that's produced by the CGM.
Yeah, well, it's been so great to have you in the program, both of you. And so just, I guess, a brief overview of what Levels is. So Levels is really the first program that uses a wearable device to break through the mystery of trying to guess what to eat. So how it does that is, Pam was just showing off her patch on the back of her arm, but it's a continuous glucose monitor. So a tiny little quarter-sized wearable device that sticks on the back of your arm and is actually doing a lab test every 5 to 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, looking at your blood sugar and testing what that is in your body and sending that information to your smartphone. So it's kind of creating a movie of what's happening metabolically in your body in response to all the different things that you do every day, from eating to sleeping, exercise, if you're stressed. All of these things are picked up on this monitor through the readout of what's happening to your glucose. So, nutrition has notoriously sort of been a black box where we eat things and we kind of try to sense what's happening. How do we feel? Are we gaining weight? But these are all really sometimes imprecise and lagging indicators. We could eat a whole day of food. The average person eats, 2 to 3 pounds of food a day. And then we have to the next morning step on the scale and somehow determine which of the foods or which of the dozens of things we ate the day before are causing the results. And that's really hard. So having closed loop biofeedback, so a narrower window between an action and a reaction, really helps guide decision-making and helps us parse through what actually works for me, what is contributing to my goals and what isn't. An example of this could be something like breakfast is a big one. A lot of people eat very high carb breakfasts in the United States these days. And things like, pastries or oatmeal or cereal or granola, Pop-Tarts, and then often people feel this mid-morning crash, a couple hours later. They're like, oh God, I need to have another cup of coffee. Did I not get enough sleep last night? But when you put on a continuous glucose monitor, what you might see is that after your oatmeal that you thought was heart healthy and, going to fuel you with the whole grains, that actually your blood glucose shot through the roof, like went straight up and then crashed down. And that's right when you're feeling kind of tired and lethargic in the morning. So for the first time, as opposed to just taking the box's word for it, that it's a heart healthy, good, breakfast idea, you can see that actually that might not have been the right choice for you, that it's putting you on this roller coaster of glucose that's leading you to be spiked and then fatigued. And so those types of insights can help you really work through foods quickly and experiment and realize what is keeping my blood sugar more stable throughout the day, because that's ultimately what we want. We want a more stable, sort of gentle rolling hills in our glucose. We do not want those spikes and crashes, which we know are associated with fatigue and mood lability, and over the long term can lead to insulin resistance, the process where your body basically has so many glucose spikes over time and so many, insulin surges it has to do to basically take up that glucose out of the bloodstream, that your cells become numb to that insulin. And that's really the process towards metabolic dysfunction and diabetes, which almost half of our country is dealing with. Almost half the country is pre-diabetic or has type 2 diabetes. So that's kind of the big picture, really personalized nutrition for your own body, and understanding what foods are actually doing to you in real time so you can make better decisions. So the way that Levels, sort of the program that we put together, is giving people access to this wearable technology, these continuous glucose monitors, for the first time for wellness purposes. These are devices that have been traditionally used as a management tool for type 2 and type 1 diabetes, because it allows people with disorders of blood sugar regulation to see their glucose 24 hours a day. And that really helps with treatment decisions. But when you open this up into the world of personalizing nutrition, it's just the sky's the limit for who this can help. I think we all are on this journey of figuring out what diet's right for us. So there's several features in Levels that really help people do that and help people parse through what they're eating and figure out what's right for them. The first thing that people will see when they come on the app is their homepage, which shows a metabolic score, which is really a 24-hour composite metric that's looking at kind of the variability throughout the day. How much up and down spikiness is happening in your glucose, and sort of where's your baseline. And that's molded into a metabolic score that you see on your homepage, kind of a snapshot of where you're doing that day. There's also going to be a lot of education on the front of the app, because metabolic health is new for a lot of people and what that really means. And so education is a really core part of our program. Lots of articles written by some of the best thinkers in the metabolic health space, people like Dr. Dom D'Agostino, Dr. Ben Bickman, Dr. David Perlmutter, several of the key scientific thought leaders in this space. And then you're going to see some of your activity responses to specific foods. So what happens is, if you are about to eat a meal and you've got that meal in front of you, you can snap a quick picture of that meal and upload that to the Levels app and write a short note about what you're eating. So, salad with, chicken and olive oil and vinegar and nuts or whatever. Then after you eat that, so that's time-stamped and in the app, after you eat that, something's going to happen with your blood sugar as that food is digested. You're going to digest that food, and any of the carbohydrates in that food are going to break down and turn into glucose in the bloodstream. And so usually that process of that digestion and the glucose rise in the blood and then the insulin in the blood helping you take that glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells takes around 2 hours in the average person, sometimes quicker, sometimes longer. And so that 2-hour window is what Levels calls a zone. So in that zone, we want to analyze everything that's happened from the time you ate to about 2 hours after. And we also want to analyze, were there any other activities in there that may have spiked your blood sugar or lowered your blood sugar? For instance, did you take a walk after the meal? Or did you eat something 30 minutes after your meal? And that all gets incorporated into the zone. So at 2 hours, you end up getting what's called a zone score, which is a composite metric that tells you just a quick sort of grade of 1 to 10 of how much of a glucose impact that meal had. So if you get a 10, that's essentially sort of a perfect score. That's saying you had very little glycemic response to this meal. Your blood sugar barely raised at all. And a 1 would be a very large glucose excursion, up 70, 80 points or something like that, and taking a while to come down. So that score is just, as opposed to having to parse through the individual numbers of glucose, like, I went from 79 milligrams per deciliter to 131 milligrams per deciliter, and then I came back in 45 minutes. It just parses all of that into a score. So really the goal would be to get as many 8, 9, 10 zone scores for your meals as possible, because that's going to be those more gentle rolling hills. And then what's cool is that you can compare different zones. So there's different versions of each meal. I eat a lot of cauliflower rice for stir fries and things like that. And you might eat sort of a cauliflower veggie stir fry rice 3 nights in a row and have a different sauce on each of them. And that sauce might have a huge impact on how much your glucose rises because of what's in that sauce. Or you might add protein one night. You might add tofu or chicken or whatever. Or you might add more fat to one of them, nuts or tahini or whatever, olive oil. You can compare each of those different versions of a similar meal and start to figure out what is the variable that's changing the glucose response. And we have a neat feature called the compare feature, where you can actually graph many different versions of those types of, different variables of a meal and see exactly how each one is raising or, your blood sugar. So for me, something that was a really interesting experiment was whenever I have white rice, my blood sugar goes to the roof. And this is not the case for everyone, but for me, it's just a one zone score pretty much every time I eat white rice. So sushi is not great for me, even if even if there's fish or avocado, which is fat and protein, which usually should diminish a glucose spike. Fat and protein tend to blunt the amount of glucose that's going into your bloodstream quickly. So, you'd think, oh, well, if I have salmon and avocado on my rice, it's going to be a lower response. Well, that's not the case for me. I still go up to maybe 160, 170 milligrams per deciliter on my glucose, way higher than I ever want it to be. And then I went to this restaurant in New York where they were serving cauliflower rice sushi. So instead of rice, it was cauliflower rice, and it was delicious. It tasted pretty much exactly the same. And my glucose was flat. I had a ton of sushi and it was just zero elevation. So I graphed those next to each other and I see regular sushi, it's a mountain peak spike, comes down, crashing down. And then I have, this dip after it comes crashing down, which is often where people feel jittery and hangry and cravings. And with the cauliflower rice sushi, it was flat. So I now have this clear graph saying, eat the cauliflower rice sushi. This is much, much better for your body. And everyone's going to have different versions of that because we all respond to food differently in terms of how much it raises our glucose. But for me, that's a helpful feature. So those are some of the things that kind of allow people to, figure out what's going on specifically with their diet. We also have some really great integrations. So we import data from Apple Health and Google Health Kit, and that can pull in your sleep data and your activity data. So you can start to overlay your sleep trends and your movement trends with the glucose data. And again, really start parsing out which variables are having a positive or negative impact on your blood sugar. For me, I know that taking a 10, 15-minute walk after any meal has a significant impact on lowering my post-meal glucose levels. And I can see that with many trials on my zone scores. When I add a walk, when I have the word walk in my zone, it's always a little bit lower. And so you can figure that out when you have that those extra data streams. So glucose is a complex, where our glucose is at in our body at any given time is sort of a readout of many different variables: the sleep, the stress management, the exercise, and of course the food. And creating that model for yourself of how each one is sort of pulling the levers on glucose is what we're really giving, to our members through the Levels program.
Yeah, it's been an epiphany, I must say. I was really excited to just get the chance to have a CGM. I think everybody should have to wear a CGM for at least a month somewhere along the way so that they really understand what happens to their blood glucose when they eat stuff, and when they do other things as well. That, huge stress at work, not getting enough sleep, all of those kinds of things. See how that affects it as well. We were talking a little bit about my experience off camera before we started here. When hopefully we can get back to that, but we didn't talk about Pam's experiences, and to be honest, I haven't even had any long conversations with her about what she's seen. So I'd be really interested to hear what she's been seeing.
Casey, as we share a lot of basic information about what blood sugars can do based on our lifestyle choices and what we eat and what we do, it's really interesting for a lot of people who have even already been doing a low carb, metabolically healthy diet lifestyle. And then maybe we don't usually we haven't done any experimentation or cheating kind of things to see what happens. We may in the next 2 weeks, because we've got it for 30 days. So there's a 2 week we have to change today, in fact. So we're 2 weeks in, we're going to change it again and see. But we've been pretty consistently, we often eat the same things. But it's interesting because the ups and downs, the large ups and downs that I've seen have been on like a Zoom meeting, which is interesting, up into the mid to high 100s, which I was surprised about. We're brainstorming about our event planning that's coming up. or getting inspired by the conversations. I've seen those go up and down. But the other interesting thing is when I'm showering. So you're not going to avoid showering. You're not going to, do anything. So just a knowledge of some of those activities that are where you're seeing those ups and downs higher than I thought it should be. And showering's not a stressful thing for me. It's fairly relaxing, but and so that was an interesting note for me. Those were the two ups and downs. A little lower at night than I thought it would be. Although I think when I'm testing it with a blood glucose meter, because if it starts going down, it'll often say, wait, stop, go and test on your blood sugar meter, glucose meter, to correlate those numbers. So maybe you can even touch on that a little bit. And I noticed about a 10 millimoles difference where it was a little bit higher than what the CGM said.
Yeah, so we can touch on all three of those. Those are all really great observations. I think the first one that you mentioned was the relationship between sort of being on a Zoom call or maybe a slightly stressful situation and what's happening on your monitor. You mentioned sensor accuracy and then also like lows at night. So those are all great to dive into. So in terms of the first one, the stress piece is really, really interesting. Our body is really trying to help us with this response. But it's a little bit maladaptive in our modern world. So historically, if we had a stress or a threat or something like that, it was usually physical in nature. Like we had to, run from a lion or whatever. Like we're thinking way back when historically.
Hunting.
Exactly. Yeah. These days, our stressors are these chronic low-grade stressors that are more psychological in nature. Like, our phone dinging and our emails and being on these Zoom calls and giving talks and things like that, or honking or whatever it is. And it's sort of this like peppered throughout the day. In the former, we needed our muscles to actually respond to that threat. So the body would dump glucose from the liver when we were under times of threat to feed the muscles. But when we're responding to an email or we're stressed from a honk or whatever, we don't need those muscles to have glucose. We're not running from anything. So we dump this glucose, but there's no sink for it. There's no, place to dispose of that through our muscles. And so that is sort of what we're caught in right now, is these chronic low-grade sort of signals from our body, usually catecholamine hormones. So things like cortisol and epinephrine that are telling our liver to keep producing glucose to sort of help us respond to a threat, but we don't really need that anymore. So there's been some interesting studies looking at breathing techniques and meditation and sort of this more mindfulness-based practices, which send that signal to our body that we are safe and we are, fine. We don't need to surge out that cortisol. We don't need to surge that epinephrine, which actually have an impact on blood sugar levels, which is really, really interesting. So that's been something I've incorporated a lot into my life since using CGM for the past 2 years, because I had a similar experience to you. Actually, the very first podcast I ever did about 2 years ago, I was, of course, a little bit nervous and my blood glucose went up to like 140 and I was fasted. I had no exogenous, oral glucose going in. So I knew this was coming from my liver saying, here you go, here's all this glucose to fight this battle. But of course it wasn't. It was just me sitting in a chair talking. Mm-hmm. And so I realized, wow, if this is happening 5 times a day, 7 days a week for 30 years, that is so much on my body to have to process all of that and have that exposure to glucose. So now I'm much more intentional about taking those deep diaphragmatic breaths when I'm feeling a little activated, hopefully through my vagus nerve to tell my body you're safe. And I'm actually now most days I wear, this is a Apollo Neuroscience. It's a little vibration device. I'm wearing my Whoop and my Apollo. This Whoop tests my heart rate variability, which is an objective measure of stress. And then this is a vibrating sensor that's constantly telling your body a soothing signal of, you're safe, don't worry. And it's a really interesting device with a lot of clinical evidence behind it that basically through touch is telling your body that you're safe. So when I'm at my computer and I know I'm getting those constant pings throughout the day, I always have this on because it's that counter signal of it's fine. And a lot of that is rooted in my observations I've seen through my blood glucose. So So that's sort of an interesting one. And I am really curious for how these wearables that are telling us about glucose and maybe future wearables that are primarily focused on nutrition can also be kind of mindfulness biofeedback tools. So, so that was piece number one about the stress. And I think the second was about your sleep. You're seeing lows at night.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing a spike in the morning because we have also incorporated an early morning meditation first thing. So I don't see any dawn effect or anything like that on mine because we are doing mindfulness and breathing and meditation first thing. So that keeps it level in the morning. So go ahead and add your input.
No, that's amazing. I have to say that's actually a study that I really want to see done because I've recommended what you just said to many patients before, which is, so for people listening, and the dawn effect is this phenomenon that happens in the body where first thing in the morning, our body releases cortisol to help us get out of bed. You know, we need this like stress signal to say up, rise from your slumber, start walking, etc. And that can lead to that glucose dump in the body, which can lead to an elevation in glucose first thing in the morning, even though you haven't eaten anything. And some people, like people with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, it can be a very large response because it's in the setting of insulin resistance or low insulin. And so, you know, so you're not clearing that glucose as quickly. And because psychological stress can have an impact on cortisol levels, I think many people have a hunch that if we are more stressed or have gotten less sleep, which also raises cortisol, that it could potentially lead to a larger dawn effect. That has not been proven in the research literature, but you know, there's mechanistic sort of theory that could be happening. There are studies in people with type 2 diabetes showing that sleep deprivation increases the magnitude of the dawn effect, which is interesting. But I think getting into that, getting really quality sleep and focusing when you wake up on giving your body those safety signals. I think a lot of us wake up and it's like, we're immediately stressed. Like there's so much to do. What are we doing? Exactly. That's just all going to compound that. So I think your strategy is beautiful. And it'd be interesting to see if any days that you don't do that, or that you happen to just really be on the go from the second you open your eyes, if you see anything different on that. So,
go back to the lows, because I know, like, especially for a type 1 diabetic, that's going to be really important. They're going to need to know, do they need to adjust that? For us, as being in a fat adapted state, the lows they're not as low, and I don't think they're as concerning for us, but it's interesting to see. So just go ahead a little bit. Yeah. I interrupted you a little bit more. No. This.
Well, with the type 1, people living with type 1 diabetes, it's a different situation than what we're kind of talking about, because there's exogenous insulin that's being injected, and that can have an impact on those nighttime lows. But for the average person without type 1 or type 2 diabetes, you can see lows at night for several reasons. The first is that glucose just happens to be lower during REM sleep. So glucose tends to be 5 to 10% lower during REM cycles. So that's one thing. The second can be related to what we ate at night. If people eat a very high carb meal late at night, which for the average American, they are, it's dinner with potato and bread and then dessert, which is the worst thing we could be doing late at night. And we're also eating really late, or we're maybe snacking on popcorn after dinner if we're watching a movie. It's like carbs, 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 carbs. You may be going on a big glucose spike at night and then sort of crashing down. And overnight, you're kind of in that reactive hypoglycemia phase. So that's another thing that can happen. So I tend to really move towards keto as the day goes on, because I don't want to have that blood sugar elevated while I'm sleeping. And I know that it's going to impair my sleep quality if I'm bouncing around all night. And certainly if people want to eat like the dessert or whatever, I would front load it in the front of the day and then make sure you're, working out or walking or whatever, and having a glucose sink through muscles after that. Don't just put it in your body and then go to sleep where it's just kind of sitting in the bloodstream all night. We're also a little bit insulin resistant at night because of the hormone. There's a lot of reasons for this, but as we get ready, to get prepared for sleep, we release melatonin in the body, and that can have an impact on our insulin sensitivity and our pancreatic function. The pancreas produces our insulin. And so the same amount of calories and the same sort of macro carbohydrate composition later at night may have more of a glycemic effect than if you ate that exact same thing earlier in the day. So kind of got to be smart about timing with these types of things, and make sure you're, if you're eating the higher carbohydrate foods, doing it in a part of the day where you are more insulin sensitive, ideally not in a time of high stress, and can use your muscles to help kind of create that glucose sink after that exposure, which none of those things are usually at night. So that's the second piece. The third piece is actually a sensor issue. So it's what's called pressure-induced sensor error. So when you lay on the sensor, which can happen, as you're rolling around at night, that can actually cause erroneously low readings. So people will sometimes see like a sharp dip down to like 40s or 50s at night, and that very well could be pressure-induced sensor error.
I've seen that once on like the second night, or about the second night that I had it, that there was this, just because it reads every 15 minutes or so and stores it, right, until you scan.
Right.
But so through the night there's somewhere I saw this one spike down, just one reading that dropped down, and the next one was back up again. So I was assuming that something like that, I'd turned and leaned on it or something at that point, because I never saw it again. So I was assuming that was.
I would guess that's what that was. Yeah. They've done studies where they basically like film people wearing sensors in the hospital, and when they lay on the side, it goes choop, and then they roll over and it comes back. So, and then I think the third piece you mentioned, Pam, was sensor, like the difference between your finger stick blood glucose and then what's going on with the sensor. So this just kind of, again, gets into the hardware side of things. So the sensor that you're wearing on the arm is measuring glucose from what's called the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid around cells. So just the clear fluid that exists, in between cells. The finger prick is measuring capillary blood glucose. So that's actually in the blood. So two different compartments that tend to trend almost identical with each other with a little bit of a time delay, where glucose in the interstitial fluid is usually like 5 to 10 minutes delayed from what's in the blood, but should be about the same number. The sensor does have a margin of error, like any test or wearable device. And the continuous glucose monitors is around 9%. From like on average, the readings in the blood and readings in the interstitial fluid are about 10% difference. That's called the MARD. And this is pretty similar to other wearables on the market, things like a Fitbit or a Whoop or whatever. So and this is an FDA approved device for the management of diabetes. So the FDA has deemed this level of difference between blood and interstitial fluid to be safe for the management of disease. So
and so if I just want to jump in there, and it's like I've done a lot of blood measurements as well, and to do a comparison over these last 2 weeks, and there has been a difference, but I've found it very consistent. So it's not like there's a 10% variability, right? So one time it's 10% above and one time 10% below. It's like pretty much always around 10 points different, right? In the case that the blood glucose is 10%, 10 points higher, or 10 milligrams higher, basically. But that's okay, because now the thing is that now you've got a trend, right? And so if it's reading, if it comes like mine, sometimes dips down to 68, which is in a red zone, but I know that that's really about 78, and that's okay, but what I'm really looking for is how flat the thing is and whether there's any spikes and drops, and like outside of that kind of little flat region that mine normally sits in.
That's exactly right. And that's what we remind our members, is that it's the trends that are most important here. This is a behavior change and awareness tool. And, if you're 5 or 6 points off, that's not going to have a huge impact. But the delta between when you start a meal and your peak after a meal, that is generally going to be very accurate. And that you can see very clearly, even if your frame shifted a little bit off. And the sensors that you two are both wearing are what are called the Abbott Freestyle Libre, made by the company Abbott. These do not have a calibration feature, meaning that you can't, take your blood then put that into the device.
So some of them, the other ones, you can actually do that.
Yes. So the Dexcom, there's 3 main companies that make hardware for this, and they're all FDA approved. And the Dexcom G6, which is a different device, allows a calibration feature where you can prick your finger in the morning and get an exact, really spot on. Although the finger stick, those also have inaccuracy too.
Yeah. There's variability there too.
There is. And so I think the key thing to focus on is those trends. It's like, how flat or variable are you? And then how much are things changing after a specific meal? That's where the meat of the learning is. And if you're trying to get, a very precise fasting glucose level, that's probably something better done with a finger stick. But what you can do is see over the day-to-day, how is your fasting glucose bouncing around? For me, I know, if I have a very busy day and I'm a little stressed and I don't exercise, I'm sitting at my desk most of the day, not on my standing desk, and I don't get good sleep, my fasting glucose could be 10 or 15 points higher than it was the day before when I got great sleep and I meditated and I ate perfectly and all this stuff, exercised. So to see that variability on the CGM is useful, but the exact number, if you're looking to say what is my fasting blood glucose today, that's probably something better to get done with a finger prick or a venous plasma sample.
And even then do 2 or 3 of those, because there's errors and stuff in that as well. So if you want to be sure of accuracy, you need to check a few times.
Right.
So maybe let's go back to what we were talking about before we started here. But so my biggest, not epiphany, but my biggest surprise, I think, with this is, for those, and a lot of people that will be listening to this podcast are familiar with what we do, and that we've incorporated Dr. Ben Bakikio's exercise philosophy into what we teach and what we advise people to consider taking on board. And it involves a 15-minute exercise routine twice a week, which is very high intensity, where you take an exercise for each major muscle group and you load yourself so that you fail completely between 30 and 90 seconds. And then you move on to the next muscle group. And I have been doing it where it's been taxing me aerobically and globally, as well as that particular muscle group. So I'm breathing really, really hard at the end of an exercise. And instead of waiting until I'm completely back to normal again before doing the next one, I get a bit of my breath back, but still breathing hard. And I do that, and I move on to the next exercise. So by the time I get to the end of the 15 minutes, I am toast. And I basically lie there on the bench for 15 minutes to recover. So since I've got this thing, what I've been doing is like taking a measurement, like scanning before I start, after the leg exercises, after the upper body exercises, and then there's a core exercise part and then I measure after that, and then I'm finished. And I lie on the bench for 15 minutes, and then I measure again after that 15 minutes. And all 4 times now, I've all the scans have been like 81, 81, 82, 81, 81, and then sit there for the 15 minutes. Now that I've stopped and I'm just lying there recovering, and within like a 5-minute space, and in that 15-minute window, my blood glucose just like shoots up to like 178 or something, and then over about 2 hours, it comes down back down to normal again. So it doesn't spike up and then have this massive insulin response so that it like spikes way down and go hypo and all of that. But it was just fascinating to me. I had no idea that my own body was producing that amount of glucose that easily. And my hypothesis of this is that it's basically under these immense stress conditions, manufacturing what it needs to survive. And then when I suddenly stop, there is a little bit of latency there before it realizes, okay, the lion's gone away now, you can relax. And so at that point, it starts damping that down. And so it stops producing glucose, and then the insulin has its chance to, which I think is very cool, because now it's pushing glycogen back into those muscles that I've basically
you've depleted. I was going to say you've depleted all the
depleted them
muscle
completely. So that glucose is now being pushed back into the muscles, back into the liver, restoring my glycogen stores. And it's a very healthy response, but it's twice a week. And it's not chronic elevations. And I think that's where the real damage comes, is when our blood glucose and insulin levels correspondingly are chronically elevated. That's where, from all the research that we've been involved in, that's where we see the real damage occurring.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you're describing an example of a really interesting and fairly well established in terms of the science phenomenon, which is where high intensity training, so usually above about an 80% VO2 max or 80% max heart rate, is going to do exactly what you said. It's going to cause a stress response. It's going to release those catecholamine hormones. And in very high intensity training, that can cause the liver to be stimulated to do an 8-fold increase in the production of glucose from the liver. And then if you look at the muscles, so you're doing a workout, you're obviously using glucose, but their increase of glucose only goes up by about 3 to 4-fold. So the result is this sort of supply demand mismatch where there's excess glucose in the blood from the liver, overcompensating for the need. And that can lead to that spike that you're seeing. And often this, this will persist for up to like an hour after a workout for some people. People might not see it start for 10, 15 minutes into the workout, because you're kind of, all these processes are starting, and then it might kind of increase right after and then come back down, usually within that hour to 2 hour time frame for most people. But like you said, it's very different than a food induced spike. Totally different. I mean, first of all, it's different physiology. It's being produced in the liver from breakdown of glycogen or from gluconeogenesis. It's not just carbs going straight into your bloodstream. And the most important thing is that there's a sink for it. There's something to pull it out of the bloodstream, which is muscle contraction. And the interesting thing about muscle as a tissue is that it's one of the only tissues that don't require insulin to take up glucose. So muscle contraction in its own right leads to glucose absorption into the cell, not requiring insulin. So you may not get that huge insulin surge that you'd get from just eating the food. So there's that. And we also know that high intensity interval training is incredibly useful at increasing insulin sensitivity in general. I mean, it upregulates the cellular signaling pathways that improve insulin sensitivity. And people have done studies showing that even 2 weeks of higher intensity interval training workout can have a significant impact on fasting glucose and insulin sensitivity. So those spikes are not ones that I would worry about. With that said, there has been research showing that there can be too much high intensity interval training per week, and that can actually become a stressor on the body, like a chronic stressor that can lead to metabolic dysfunction. So for those people who are like, okay, well, if a little bit is good, then a lot is better, that might not be true.
No, and I think that's a big thing with Dr. Ben's thing. It's like literally twice a week. And his whole point in that is that your muscles and your whole system metabolically requires that time to properly recover before you do it again. And if you're going into the gym and you're having that response every day, that's basically chronic elevation, or even though it's a spike each day, it's still excessive. And that's where I feel, yes, doing too much of it is actually detrimental and not helpful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there was a study just a couple months ago that looked at high intensity interval training, and they showed actual numbers. So in their research, it was 90 minutes of high intensity interval training per week was well tolerated, but 150 minutes per week was associated with metabolic maladaptations and more glucose intolerance. This was a 4-week study, but it was neat that they actually were able to give some concrete numbers for that. So we all want to get at least 150 minutes of aerobic activity per week. That is sort of the bare minimum for what has been shown to be associated with positive mental health outcomes, cardiovascular health outcomes. But those 150 minutes should not all be high intensity interval training.
Yeah, Dr. Ben, he has a thing where he says his high intensity interval training, slow maximum resistance training, and then activity. So activity is still movement. Activity is still good for your mental health, your, like you're saying, using up blood sugar, keeping moving, keeping strong, strength and stability, as well as the strength training. So not overtraining, but continue to move throughout the week and all throughout your days for better sleep, for better, all kinds of things. So.
One of the biggest takeaways from looking at so much of this literature that I've really come to the conclusions of with exercise training and glucose are really three things. One is the importance of resistance training. When you grow your muscles, you grow the amount of tissue that's taking up glucose at baseline. It is this literally just like bigger glucose absorption machine at baseline, even when you're sitting. So more muscle, better. So some resistance training in there is going to be really important. And I think for a lot of people who are maybe struggling with weight loss or on a plateau or something like that and are doing a lot of cardio, sometimes bringing in that resistance training can be that thing that unlocks the next phase of, moving towards fitness goals, because you're improving your insulin sensitivity, you're improving that glucose sink. The second thing is the piece about high intensity interval training. It's really good for insulin sensitivity, but too much, it's a stressor on the body. So really balance that. And it shouldn't be 7 days a week, probably 2 to 3 maybe. And then the third piece is that more movement is better for metabolic health. And this really comes from a lot of studies just looking at really low intensity, like walking and jogging. And what this research has shown is that people who move just more consistently throughout the day have better metabolic outcomes. So as opposed to just doing like 1 30-minute or 2 30-minute or 1 1-hour workout per day, which is great, like a jog or a run or whatever, moving actually a few minutes each hour is probably better. So getting up and, if you have an exercise machine in the house, doing 3 or 4 minutes per hour or every 30 minutes, keeping things moving, it makes sense. That's what our bodies are designed to do. They're designed to move throughout the day. They're not designed to sit for 8 hours and then work out for 1 hour. And so there's research to support that. And in one of them specifically, they took 3 groups of people and they had people do 20 minutes of walking or jogging before each meal. So that's 3 meals. So cumulatively 60 minutes. Then people who did that after each meal. So again, cumulatively 60 minutes, 20 minutes after each meal. And then people who walked or jogged for 2 minutes every 30 minutes throughout the whole day. And the best glucose which also added up to 60 minutes. The best glucose outcomes were in the group that did it 2 minutes throughout the day, every half hour. So that's really shifted my thinking to like, well, I'm normally on a treadmill desk and I walk at a very low intensity, but I know my body feels better and functions better when I'm moving. And I don't walk all day, but I would probably walk 5 hours a day during the workday, very slowly. But my body and my feeling of being really, lean and just feeling really alive are definitely better on the days that I'm moving more constitutively throughout the day. I think the energy flows better. And, we know it's better for metabolic health. So that's a takeaway. Move more, low intensity.
Yeah. No, this has been an incredible experience. Thanks again for allowing us to do this. And we still have another 2 weeks to try some other things. Like Pam says, we're not cheaters. Like we just don't. We've been doing this for like 5 years now, and I've had a couple of times. I don't think I've ever cheated. It's like it's done so much good for me. I was like, why would I want to? But maybe I'll go and buy a real Coke or something at some point, and for the sake of science, right? I'll actually drink it, and maybe eat some vegetation as well that I don't normally eat, and just to see what that does to the readings. I'll be a Dave Feldman for 2 weeks and just
Do some
abuse my
experimenting.
own body for science. Yeah.
Our friends have a restaurant that serves cauliflower crust pizza, but I've asked them and I know the ingredients and I'm like, oh, of course it's like the gluten-free all rice flour, which like you were saying, rice doesn't do well for you. Ground up rice doesn't necessarily do well for a lot of people. So, but I'd be interesting to see. It's pretty
Yeah.
thin crust.
Maybe
to
we
see
go
what it
there on
does.
Friday and we both try
Maybe we
that
try.
and
Yeah.
then see what it does. Yeah.
The experiments can be really interesting. We, much to the, this is not something our team, obviously at Levels, is a very metabolically aware team, but we decided to all drink a 12-ounce can of Coke, which, I mean, I haven't had soda probably in 25 years. And 13 people did this experiment, and we found that the median blood glucose peak was 162 milligrams per deciliter. Mine went up 62 points in 20 minutes. So I said before, it usually takes about 2 hours to go up and come down. With that liquid glucose fructose load, my glucose actually peaked in 20 minutes. So it's essentially pouring sugar into your veins. And that's with the delay on the CGM. I mean, it was crazy. It was literally a straight up, the alarm was giving me, or the sensor was giving me alarms. Like I felt like crap and I crashed down. For reference, I try and never really get above 110. I mean, I will sometimes get up to like 140, 150 if I'm at a restaurant and it's out of my control. But generally speaking, I'm trying to stay below 110 after a meal. So going up to 162 is quite high and not something I want to do frequently. So the Coke thing is really just a reconfirmation of why a carb aware
why you
diet,
don't drink it, right?
why we don't drink it. But I do encourage you to try some vegetables. I'm plant-based. I will eat fish here and there, but what and maybe once every couple of months, I'll eat a few ounces of like grass-fed, pasture-raised beef or something like that. But I would say 97% of my diet is, beans, legumes, vegetables, very low glycemic fruits, nuts, seeds, spices. That's, whole foods, plant-based. My glucose is flat. My triglycerides are in the 50s. It's not like there's, I'm in ketosis most of the time, like somewhere between 0.9 and 1.5. So that would not really be possible in my mind without having used a CGM for 2 years, because my plant-based diet is radically different than what it was 2 years ago, even though then it was still a very whole foods plant-based diet, but it was a lot more sweet potatoes, grains, quinoa, plant-based pastas.
Lots of carbs in there. Yeah.
Tons. And I was going up and down, up and down, up and down. Now it's very different. If I do eat beans, I focus a lot on fiber. So my net carbs are still fairly low. But I'm eating beans. And if I do that, I add a lot of extra fat, protein, fiber to the beans. And then I'm just completely flat. I mean, literally 3 or 4 point glucose elevation. So it might be interesting to experiment with that, because there really is a way to do, stay in the ketogenic state with a really kind of nuanced glucose informed plant.
Yeah. And then I think that's the important thing. And then we never try and isolate any particular group. If you want to be vegan, whatever it is, if that's what you feel you need to do, we're here to support you if you want, as long as you understand that you still need to be low carb and you need to be aware of that and supplement, do whatever you need to do to make that diet work for you. But you can't go and eat just like a bunch of sweet potatoes and all that kind of stuff and expect to because now you're not going to be able to stay in ketosis, and you're not going to be able to get the benefits of what we talk about.
Right.
But it's awesome to hear, because we do have vegetarians and a few vegans that want to do this, and they're always looking for validation, and yes, it can be done, and that I don't have to become a carnivore in order to do this, and that's super to hear.
You don't, but you do have to be very dialed in.
Very mindful, yeah, exactly.
Like, if I eat a sweet potato at 9 p.m., my ketones are going to be 0.1 the next day. I could kick myself out of a week of being above 1.0 on my Keto-Mojo just with one big, very healthy, quote unquote, plant-based meal. And
right, yeah.
I'm not demonizing sweet potatoes. I mean, but for me,
you know what they do for you.
And
Yeah.
through the roof.
Yeah.
And for some people, they're not. So
That's what you want to know, is how do you respond? Individuality, personalized nutrition, all of that is what we're kind of striving for. So Casey, I'm really appreciative of your time. So just quickly let people know how they can get a hold of you. Is there a way that somebody can get a CGM or work with Levels and work with your program with something they already have, or can they get it without a doctor prescription? Can they work with you? How do they do that and get a hold and follow what you guys are doing?
Yeah. So first of all, to kind of find out more about Levels, we're at levelshealth.com. Our blog, I highly recommend levelshealth.com/blog. Incredible information, not the average stuff, you're going to read on the internet. It's very, very nuanced, and I think helps, just like you guys are doing, put content that gets people really thinking about this stuff in a way that applies to their lives. So levelshealth.com/blog. We're on Instagram and Twitter at Levels. And that's fun to follow because a lot of our beta members are posting the experiments they're doing and what they're learning. So it can spark some interesting ideas for when people actually do use the CGM. In terms of getting access, so CGMs are prescription-only devices in the US. They do require a physician prescription. So with Levels, that physician prescription is part of the program. We are in a closed, have not launched yet. So we unfortunately don't have full access, but people should sign up at levelshealth.com for the early access program. And as we start, being able to scale up numbers of people in the program, we'll be sure to let them know. But I think by end of this year, we should be able to kind of accommodate all the people coming in and wanting to try this. So definitely stay in the ecosystem, and we'll update people. But in the meantime, people can ask their primary care doctor for a continuous glucose monitor. And
if they won't give it to you, fire them and find one that will.
Right? A lot of doctors aren't familiar with using this in this way for nutrition and for personalizing your diet. And so they may be caught off guard, say, you're not diabetic, you don't have diabetes. Why would I prescribe this to you? But I think the tide is changing there because a lot of people are realizing, we're in a huge metabolic health crisis where 74% of the country is overweight. A lot of that is being driven by high insulin levels. And of course, prior to that, high glucose levels. And so I think we're going to start really this is going to be brought more into the mainstream because people want to do better. Over half of Americans are going on a diet each year, and yet our weight is still going up. So I think more tools that are really diving into the personalized nutrition is going to hopefully start turning the tide of this epidemic that we're in.
We sure hope so, because we want less people to be surprised when they get to the point where their doctor tells them they're pre-diabetic or all the way to diabetes because they hadn't had anything to gauge where they were, what was happening metabolically with how are they processing sugars and should they limit them. So Thank you so much for doing what you're doing, and thanks so much for allowing us to be part of your pre-launch and testing out and letting everybody know what the app's like and all of the things that you put in place for us to follow what's going on in our bodies and make a good plan for ourselves.
Thank you so much, Pam and Doug, and thank you for the good work that you guys are doing too. I'm so glad to have had this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, us too. We appreciate it. Thanks, bye.
You've been listening to an episode of the Low Carb USA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lowcarbusa.